In the shadows of the roaring 1920s, beneath the gleam of progress and prosperity, a silent horror was unfolding. Young women, full of hope and dreams, painted glowing watch dials with a deadly secret: radium. Their bones would glow in the dark, even after death. This is their story. Before we dive deep into this haunting tale, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, so you won't miss the dark truths behind history's brightest lights. It was the year 1922, in a small factory nestled in New Jersey, home to the United States Radium Corporation. Grace Fryer, a young woman full of hope and curiosity, stepped cautiously through the factory doors, entering a world bathed in an eerie, greenish glow. The air smelled faintly of paint and metal, but the most striking thing was the soft luminescence emanating from hundreds of tiny watch dials arranged meticulously along long tables. Rows of women sat side by side, their faces illuminated by this otherworldly light as they painted delicate numbers and hands with a mysterious substance known as radium paint. "This is the future," whispered a woman next to Grace, her voice a mixture of pride and awe. "They say this paint glows in the dark, and it's going to change everything." Grace's heart raced with excitement. To work at the United States Radium Corporation meant not just earning a paycheck, but being part of something extraordinary, a technological marvel that promised to light up the night. Her hands trembled slightly as she took her place among the workers. A tiny brush was placed in her fingers, and she was handed a watch dial coated in a pale white primer. Her task was simple but delicate: to paint the numbers and hands with the glowing radium paint, making time visible even in darkness. The factory buzzed softly with whispered conversations and the rhythmic scratch of brushes on metal. The women talked about the magic of radium, how their fingers seemed to shimmer faintly after hours of work. In the shadows of the roaring 1920s, beneath the gleam of progress and prosperity, a silent horror was unfolding. Young women, full of hope and dreams, painted glowing watch dials with a deadly secret: radium. Their bones would glow in the dark, even after death. This is their story. Before we dive deep into this haunting tale, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell, so you won't miss the dark truths behind history's brightest lights. It was the year 1922, in a small factory nestled in New Jersey, home to the United States Radium Corporation. Grace Fryer, a young woman full of hope and curiosity, stepped cautiously through the factory doors, entering a world bathed in an eerie, greenish glow. The air smelled faintly of paint and metal, but the most striking thing was the soft luminescence emanating from hundreds of tiny watch dials arranged meticulously along long tables. Rows of women sat side by side, their faces illuminated by this otherworldly light as they painted delicate numbers and hands with a mysterious substance known as radium paint. "This is the future," whispered a woman next to Grace, her voice a mixture of pride and awe. "They say this paint glows in the dark, and it's going to change everything." Grace's heart raced with excitement. To work at the United States Radium Corporation meant not just earning a paycheck, but being part of something extraordinary, a technological marvel that promised to light up the night. Her hands trembled slightly as she took her place among the workers. A tiny brush was placed in her fingers, and she was handed a watch dial coated in a pale white primer. Her task was simple but delicate: to paint the numbers and hands with the glowing radium paint, making time visible even in darkness. The factory buzzed softly with whispered conversations and the rhythmic scratch of brushes on metal. The women talked about the magic of radium, how their fingers seemed to shimmer faintly after hours of work. What they didn't know was that with every lick, they swallowed tiny amounts of radium, radioactive and deadly. The paint, while mesmerizing, was a silent poison, creeping into their bodies with each stroke, each lick, each breath. As weeks turned into months, Grace began to notice subtle changes, not just in herself, but in her friends. Fatigue settled like a heavy fog. Smiles became less frequent. Mabel complained quietly of persistent toothaches, which she shrugged off with a tired laugh. The factory management continued to assure them that radium was safe, even beneficial. Leaflets boasted of its medical uses and scientific marvels. The women trusted these reassurances, even as their bodies whispered warnings they dared not speak aloud. One evening, after a long day's work, Grace caught a glimpse of her hands under the gaslight. The faintest glow lingered at her fingertips. It was mesmerizing and terrifying. How could something so beautiful be the cause of the growing pain behind her jaw? She confided in Catherine Flynn, another young woman whose laughter had grown quieter, her eyes shadowed with worry. "Do you think it's the paint?" Grace asked hesitantly. Catherine shook her head. "They say it's nonsense. It's just us being weak." But neither wanted to admit the truth. The invisible glow was no longer a marvel. It was a shadow creeping through their lives. The factory was a cage, and the radium the bars that bound them. Yet, even in the face of uncertainty and fear, the women continued their work, painting the future, one glowing number at a time. The days at the factory grew heavier, not just in work but in silence. Grace felt the weight of something unseen pressing deeper into her bones. The glow on the watch dials remained radiant and mesmerizing, but its beauty began to feel like a cruel joke. Every stroke of her brush was a step deeper into a dark unknown. Mabel and Catherine, once lively and full of laughter, were now shadows of themselves. Their smiles faded, replaced by grimaces as mysterious pains gnawed at their jaws and teeth. Whispered conversations turned to hushed fears. "Have you noticed the sores?" one woman asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "I can't eat without pain." Grace's own body betrayed her. The toothache she once ignored worsened into a persistent throb. At night, she felt a strange warmth under her skin, a subtle pulse that seemed to echo the factory's eerie green glow. She wondered, with growing dread, if the rumors were true, that some women's bones glowed faintly in the dark, long after their bodies had ceased to live. But the company's message was unwavering. "Radium is safe," the doctors declared. "These are merely symptoms of stress or hysteria." They blamed the women's minds, not the paint. The factory bosses dismissed complaints as weakness. Those who dared speak too loudly were threatened with dismissal. The invisible poison was hidden beneath layers of lies and greed. Yet the women persevered, bound by necessity and fear. They continued to dip their brushes, to lick their lips, to chase the perfection the paint demanded. The glow that had once been a beacon of hope was now a haunting reminder of a fate they could neither escape nor fully understand. Months turned into a year, and the invisible enemy tightened its grip on Grace and the women around her. The small aches grew into unrelenting pain. Grace found herself waking at night, her jaw throbbing so fiercely that even the faint glow seemed a cruel mockery of her suffering. One morning, as she stared into the mirror, she barely recognized the pale, drawn face looking back. Her once bright eyes were clouded with exhaustion and fear. But the worst was yet to come. Teeth loosened inexplicably, gums bled, and some women began to develop grotesque sores that no doctor could explain. At the factory, whispers of illness turned into open worry. Yet the management doubled down on their denials. "These are just minor ailments," they insisted. "Stress, diet, nothing to worry about." But Grace knew better. She saw her friends fall ill, their bodies weakening, their spirits breaking. The glow that had once filled their workroom with wonder was now a symbol of their slow decay. Despite everything, the women kept painting, driven by paychecks and a fragile hope. Some nights, Grace wondered if she too would become one of those pale, glowing figures in the stories, victims of a miracle turned curse. The factory buzzed with the steady rhythm of brushes tracing glowing numerals across countless watch dials. But beneath this mechanical hum, a quieter, darker story was unfolding. Grace Fryer, once full of hope and excitement, now carried a growing burden. one that no one around her seemed ready to face openly. Every morning, she awoke with a dull ache behind her jaw, a persistent throb that gnawed at her resolve. She tried to dismiss it, attributing the pain to fatigue or the strain of her work. But as days passed, the ache deepened, spreading to her teeth and gums, until eating became a painful ordeal. Around her, the signs multiplied. Mabel's once bright smile had dimmed, replaced by a grimace as her jaw swelled painfully. Catherine's laughter, which once filled the workshop, was now rare and strained. The women began to whisper in corners about mysterious illnesses, bones that hurt without injury, sores that refused to heal, teeth that fell out like autumn leaves. Yet, the factory's supervisors remained indifferent. When women voiced concerns, they were met with cold dismissal. "You're imagining things," the foreman said brusquely. "Radium is safe. Our scientists guarantee it. You're just tired, or maybe hysterical." But Grace saw the truth in the eyes of her friends. The glow that had once been a symbol of pride was now a cruel reminder of their suffering. She began to notice something even more disturbing. Her skin seemed to faintly luminesce under the gaslight at night, a ghostly echo of the paint that coated the dials. One evening, alone in her small apartment, Grace stood before a cracked mirror, her pale fingers trembling as they traced the faint glow along her bones. A chill ran down her spine. Was this glow a sign of something unnatural, something deadly? She thought of the stories she'd heard, women whose bodies continued to emit light even after death. It sounded like a nightmare, yet the evidence was too real to ignore. In the shadows of the factory, the women began to form quiet bonds, sharing their fears and whispered conversations. They swapped remedies and tried to hide their pain from the supervisors, fearing the loss of their livelihoods. The invisible poison had trapped them in a cage of radiant death. And still, the company's official stance remained unshaken. Publicly, they touted radium as a wonder element, promising progress and prosperity. Behind closed doors, they dismissed the mounting sickness as mere hysteria, an inconvenient problem best silenced. Grace's determination grew with each passing day. She refused to let herself become a forgotten casualty of this glowing nightmare. Somewhere in the depths of her being, a fire was kindling, a spark of rebellion that would one day challenge the mighty forces that sought to bury the truth. The factory lights dimmed one evening as Grace sat with a small group of women in a cramped apartment, the shadows dancing across peeling wallpaper. The pain in her jaw throbbed relentlessly, but for the first time, hope flickered among the quiet murmurs. They spoke in hushed tones about what to do next. The official denials from United States Radium Corporation had been relentless, and the company's doctors insisted their suffering was all in their heads. Yet, the women could not ignore the growing evidence. Their bodies were changing, glowing faintly beneath the surface, their teeth loosening, their strength fading. Grace, Mabel, and Catherine decided to seek outside help. They reached out to a local physician who had started to notice a pattern among the factory workers' illnesses. Dr. Harrison was cautious but intrigued, agreeing to examine them despite pressure from powerful corporate interests to stay silent. As the women underwent tests, disturbing results emerged, signs of severe radiation poisoning, something previously unknown to many. The science was new, the dangers hidden, but the truth was undeniable. The factory remained a prison. Rumors began to spread that women who complained faced dismissal or worse. Still, Grace and her friends refused to back down. They collected testimonies, shared stories of pain, and started to build a case. Outside the factory walls, the world was just beginning to learn about the dangers of radium. Scientific communities debated, newspapers whispered rumors, but corporate power and profit ruled supreme. For Grace and the other Radium Girls, the fight was no longer just about their health. It was about justice, recognition, and a chance to save future workers from the same fate. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the glowing factory floors, a cold, sterile arena where truth and power collided. Grace Fryer, once a bright-eyed dial painter, now stood as a symbol of courage, her jaw swollen but her spirit unbroken. The battle against the United States Radium Corporation had begun. Grace and her fellow Radium Girls filed a lawsuit, accusing the company of negligence and concealment of the deadly effects of radium. It was a fight not only for themselves but for every worker who had suffered in silence. Inside the courtroom, the company's lawyers wielded their wealth and influence like weapons. They attacked the women's credibility, branding their symptoms as hysteria, their claims as baseless. But Grace stood firm, recounting her ordeal with unflinching honesty. Outside, public opinion started to shift. Newspaper headlines exposed the dark reality behind the glowing paint, stirring outrage and sympathy. The Radium Girls became reluctant heroes, their pain illuminating a dark chapter of industrial history. Despite setbacks and intimidation, the women persevered. Medical experts testified about the horrors of radium poisoning, revealing how the paint's deadly particles had invaded their bodies, causing bone decay and agonizing pain. The fight was long and grueling, but each small victory was a beacon of hope. Laws began to change, safety regulations were born, and the voices of the Radium Girls echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. Grace's story was no longer just her own. It was a rallying cry for justice, a testament to resilience, and a reminder of the human cost behind progress. As the court battles dragged on, Grace found herself haunted not only by her physical pain but by the memories of those who had come before her, friends whose laughter had faded into silence, whose radiant glow outlasted their mortal lives. Women like Mabel Betcher and Catherine Flynn, whose bodies betrayed the deadly secret hidden in the very paint they had once celebrated. At night, Grace would sit by the window of her modest apartment, watching the city lights flicker against the dark sky. Her bones sometimes seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light, a cruel reminder of the invisible enemy within. The haunting knowledge that some of her fellow workers had become unwilling ghosts, their remains rumored to faintly glow even beneath the earth, pressed heavily on her heart. Yet, amid the shadows, a stubborn flame of determination burned bright. Each testimony shared in court, each headline published in newspapers, chipped away at the silence and denial that had shielded the United States Radium Corporation for so long. The fight was not just legal, it was deeply personal. For Grace and the Radium Girls, it was a battle for recognition, for dignity, and for the memory of those whose stories might otherwise be lost in the shadows. The courtroom buzzed with a tense energy that seemed almost tangible. Rows of spectators sat silently, many holding their breath as expert witnesses took the stand one after another, each bringing with them devastating evidence of what the radium paint had done to the women who had once proudly applied it. Grace Fryer, despite the pain that gnawed at her jaw and the weakness in her hands, stood firm as the harsh truth unfolded in front of the nation. X-rays projected on the walls showed fractured and decaying bones, jaws eaten away by radiation, and teeth that had loosened and fallen out without warning. The images were gruesome, impossible to deny. Outside the courthouse, the public's attention had been captured. Letters arrived by the dozen, from families who had lost loved ones, from workers afraid of their own futures, and from strangers moved by the tragic story of the glowing girls. Newspapers splashed headlines across their pages. Radium's deadly secret, women poisoned for progress, justice for the Radium Girls. The plight of these women had struck a nerve, exposing a dark underbelly of industrial greed and human suffering. Inside the courtroom, however, the battle was far from over. The United States Radium Corporation deployed its vast resources to defend itself. Lawyers employed every tactic: obfuscation, intimidation, and discrediting the women as hysterical or unreliable. Company doctors testified that the symptoms were psychosomatic, blaming the women's complaints on stress and imagined illness. Delays and procedural hurdles dragged the trial on for months, wearing down the courage of even the most determined. But Grace's voice remained clear and unyielding. When given the chance to speak, she addressed the judge and jury with raw emotion. "We were used," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "Used and discarded like tools with no value once broken. But we refuse to be forgotten. We refuse to be silenced." Her words echoed the sentiment of countless women suffering in silence, and they became a rallying cry. With every testimony, every piece of evidence presented, the veil of corporate deceit was lifted, revealing the true cost of the glowing paint. Though the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with obstacles, a faint glimmer of hope began to pierce the darkness. The Radium Girls were no longer invisible victims. They were warriors demanding justice. The courtroom battles raged on, but the real fight stretched far beyond the marble walls and polished benches. Grace and the other women found themselves thrust into a war they never expected, one against not just a powerful corporation, but a system built to protect profits over people. Each day was a grueling test of endurance. The women's bodies betrayed them with new symptoms: severe anemia, brittle bones, and agonizing pain that made even simple movements unbearable. Yet, despite their suffering, they showed up to court, determined to tell their stories and fight for the truth. The United States Radium Corporation continued its campaign of denial. Behind closed doors, executives whispered about damage control and public relations, but on the factory floor, whispers turned to fear. Workers watched as their friends grew weaker, some forced to leave work entirely, their futures uncertain. Doctors aligned with the company attempted to discredit the women by questioning their character, suggesting exaggeration or mental instability. But Grace and her companions stood firm, their testimony backed by emerging scientific studies revealing the true horrors of radium exposure. Outside the courtroom, the public's awareness grew, fueled by newspaper exposes and growing activism. Labor unions and women's rights groups began to rally behind the Radium Girls, demanding safer working conditions and corporate accountability. The battle was no longer just legal, it was social and political, shaking the foundations of industrial America. For Grace, every step forward was a victory against invisibility and injustice. The glow that had once been a curse was now a beacon, lighting the path toward change. As the lawsuit dragged on, the toll on Grace and her fellow plaintiffs deepened, not only in body but in spirit. Their once vibrant lives were shadowed by relentless pain, fatigue, and the creeping knowledge that some among them might not survive the fight. Grace often found herself reflecting on the cruel irony, how the radiant radium that had promised a brighter future had instead stolen so much. Each morning, the simple act of rising from bed was a battle against aching bones and gnawing weakness. But surrender was not an option. The women's courage became a rallying point for others, families, friends, and workers across the nation who had heard whispers of the tragedy. Supporters organized fundraisers and public meetings, drawing attention to the deadly secrets hidden beneath the glowing paint. Yet, despite growing sympathy, the company remained defiant. Legal maneuvers, delays, and intimidation tactics stretched the process, aiming to exhaust the women's resolve. Rumors swirled about settlements offered in exchange for silence, but Grace refused any compromise that would let the truth remain buried. Their fight was bigger than money. It was about recognition, justice, and a future where no worker would suffer in silence. Through every setback, Grace's determination only grew stronger. The glow inside her was no longer just a haunting reminder. It was a fire that fueled her resolve to shine light on the darkest corners of industry. By 1925, the toll of radium poisoning had become undeniable. Grace Fryer's body was frail, her jaw swollen and disfigured by the relentless decay caused by radiation. Yet, her spirit burned fiercely, fueled by the knowledge that she was not fighting alone. The courtroom was filled with testimonies from doctors who had begun to understand the devastating effects of radium. Medical science, still in its infancy regarding radiation, painted a grim picture: bones eroding from within, anemia, necrosis, and agonizing pain that no medicine could fully soothe. Outside the courtroom, the press covered the trial with growing intensity. Headlines screamed of corporate negligence and the human cost of industrial progress. The Radium Girls had become unlikely heroes, their suffering shining a harsh light on the dark practices of the United States Radium Corporation. But the company fought back hard, hiring top lawyers and experts to sow doubt and confusion. They questioned every piece of evidence, every witness, attempting to protect their fortune and reputation at all costs. Amidst the turmoil, Grace and her friends found solace in their unity. They shared letters, visited each other when health allowed, and clung to the hope that their fight would bring lasting change. The court battle had reached a breaking point. For these women, victory meant not just compensation, but acknowledgement of their pain and the promise that no future worker would suffer as they had. As the trial reached its climax, Grace Fryer and the other women found their voices growing stronger, louder, impossible to ignore. Their stories of pain and betrayal were no longer whispers behind factory walls but cries that echoed through courtrooms, newspapers, and the halls of power. Scientific experts testified with growing certainty about radium's deadly effects. X-rays and medical reports detailed the destruction: bones crumbling, jaws eaten away, bodies poisoned by a substance once hailed as a miracle. The evidence was irrefutable, a damning indictment of corporate negligence. Outside, public outrage swelled. Letters poured into newspapers. Citizens rallied, demanding justice not just for the Radium Girls but for all workers exposed to hazardous conditions. Women's rights groups and labor unions added their voices, transforming a forgotten tragedy into a movement. Yet the United States Radium Corporation remained defiant. Their legal team fought fiercely, attempting to discredit the women and delay justice. But with each passing day, the company's facade cracked under the pressure. For Grace, every testimony was a battle, every courtroom appearance a testament to resilience. Her swollen jaw and weakening body belied an unbreakable will, a refusal to let the company erase their suffering. The Radium Girls had become symbols of courage, shining light on the dark cost of progress, an inspiring change that would ripple far beyond the factory floors. The tide was shifting. In 1926, the relentless struggle of Grace and her fellow plaintiffs began to fracture the armor of the United States Radium Corporation. The company's carefully constructed veil of denial was unraveling under the combined force of science, law, and public outrage. New testimonies emerged from doctors and former employees, revealing not only the devastating health effects but also the company's willful neglect and cover-ups. Documents leaked, exposing internal memos warning executives of radium's dangers decades earlier, buried deep to protect profits. The courtroom became a battlefield where every fact, every witness was weaponized in the fight for justice. The women, once powerless workers, now commanded the spotlight, their stories gripping the nation's conscience. At the same time, activism grew outside the courtroom. Workers' rights advocates and journalists pushed for stronger labor laws and safety regulations. The Radium Girls' fight became a catalyst for change, igniting conversations about workplace safety that would echo for generations. Grace, despite her failing health, stood as a beacon of defiance and hope. Each day was harder than the last, but her resolve never faltered. The glow that once marked her as a victim now symbolized a fierce determination to protect others from the same fate. The battle was far from over, but the Radium Girls had turned the tide, lighting the way for a future where human lives mattered more than profits. The courtroom was a crucible of tension and revelation. Witness after witness brought devastating truths to light, documents showing the company's early knowledge of radium's deadly effects, testimonies of workers coerced into silence, and medical reports detailing the horror within the women's bodies. Grace Fryer, despite the physical agony that etched every line of her face, stood unwavering. Her voice, though weakened, carried the weight of countless silent sufferers. She spoke not just for herself, but for those who had already been lost, for the friends who never saw justice. The United States Radium Corporation's defense crumbled under the weight of evidence. Yet, the battle was not only legal, it was moral. The trial laid bare the true cost of industrial progress, human lives sacrificed for profit and convenience. As verdict day approached, the nation watched, divided between sympathy for the women and fear of the consequences for powerful industry. The Radium Girls had become icons, tragic heroines whose suffering demanded change. When the court finally ruled in favor of the women, it was more than a legal victory. It was a profound acknowledgement of their pain and courage, a turning point that would lead to new laws protecting workers from radiation and other industrial hazards. But the cost had been immense. Many of the women never fully recovered. Some paid the ultimate price. Their bones still held the eerie glow that had marked their tragedy, a haunting legacy and a warning for generations to come. Grace's fight had ended, but her story, and those of the Radium Girls, would shine forever in the dark, reminding the world of the price paid for progress. The courtroom battles had ended, but the story of Grace Fryer and her fellow Radium Girls was far from over. The women emerged from the trial physically broken but unbowed, carrying wounds that time could not heal. Many continued to suffer from debilitating conditions, jaw necrosis, anemia, and bone fractures, that robbed them of strength and dignity. Socially, they faced stigma and isolation. Their glowing bodies marked them as both victims and curiosities, and many struggled to find work or support. Hospitals became a second home for many, as their pain grew with every passing day. Yet, their courage sparked a wave of change. Their victory led to increased public awareness about industrial hazards and forced government agencies to introduce regulations protecting workers from radiation exposure. The trial laid the foundation for future occupational health and safety laws in the United States. Grace and the other women became symbols of resilience and sacrifice. Though many never lived to see the full fruits of their struggle, their fight changed the face of labor rights forever. Their haunting legacy, bones still glowing faintly in unmarked graves, served as a powerful reminder of the cost of progress. The legal victory won by the Radium Girls in the late 1920s was a milestone, but the path to reform was hard-won and complex. Behind the headlines lay a grim reality. United States Radium Corporation executives had long known about the dangers of radium, as revealed by leaked internal memos that showed warnings were ignored to preserve profits. Medical experts struggled to understand the effects of radiation poisoning, a condition then poorly documented. The women's testimonies and medical records provided some of the earliest evidence of radium's devastating impact, influencing scientific research and workplace safety standards. The public outcry helped push Congress and labor agencies to enact new regulations. Protective measures such as lead shields, respiratory masks, and limits on radium exposure became standard in industries handling radioactive materials. This case laid groundwork for the establishment of organizations like OSHA decades later, cementing the Radium Girls' place in history as pioneers of industrial safety advocacy. Tragically, many of the women, including Grace Fryer, who passed away in 1933 at the age of 34, did not live to see the full impact of their bravery. Yet, their fight illuminated the dark consequences of industrial negligence and forever changed the relationship between workers and corporations. Though the courtroom battles ended decades ago, the Radium Girls' story never faded. Their glowing bones, buried in unmarked graves, became a haunting symbol of industrial greed and human sacrifice. Families mourned quietly, but the truth they fought for sparked a movement. Their fight forced America to face harsh realities, corporate cover-ups, ignored warnings, and the human cost of progress. Labor laws changed, safety standards were born, and new protections arose to shield workers from deadly risks. The Radium Girls became icons of courage, their pain lighting the way for safer workplaces everywhere. Today, their story warns us not to forget the price of silence. As new technologies emerge, their legacy reminds us that innovation without responsibility can be deadly. Their bravery sparked agencies like OSHA and continues to inspire workers' rights around the world. The glowing curse that once marked them now shines as a beacon of hope and justice, proof that even in darkness, the light of truth endures. The Radium Girls' sacrifice teaches us that progress must never come at the cost of human lives, and their story remains a powerful call to protect those who build our future. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more dark histories that reveal the secrets behind the shadows. Until next time, keep seeking the truth.